Because you've got probably, I don't know, depending on your batch size, probably 8 or 9 pounds of jam, boiling hot jam, and you're trying to pour that. Now, it will pour fairly well because it's fairly thick and gooey. It will pour, but you need to, you need a steady hand. So mostly to start with, I probably use a small jug or something for the first bit, and so I use some of the stuff up, and then put the thing, and then just let them stay set. Leave them set without moving them around. Because if you start moving them around as they're semi-set, it tends to disrupt the pectin matrix, and it doesn't set very well. But it's pretty easy, really. Now, you do need a fruit which has got reasonable amount of pectin in, or you need to add some more pectin, either by adding something like apple, or by adding some, or by say maybe some currants, red currant juice, something like that. Or if you go to the shop and buy a pack of pectin, or a bottle of Certo, if you remember, they still make that, I think. I prefer the powdered, but it doesn't really matter. But you need enough pectin, you need enough sugar, and you need the acidity to be right. So in like strawberry jam, you need to add lemon juice too to keep the pH down. Otherwise, it's not going to set very well. If you want to make jam, don't start with strawberry or cherry. Strawberry and cherry are the most difficult ones to make because they've got very little pectin. You've got to add some in, and they haven't got much acid either, so you've got to, you're going to be disappointed. Start with something like blackcurrant, which is more or less guaranteed to give you a good set jam, because there's lots of pectin in it. It'll work fine. But you can use apples are a good way of doing it. And if you're making a jelly where you're straining the goo, you don't put the sugar, you boil the fruit up and then you strain it through something. This is a Lakeland, which is a slightly Heath Robinson contraction, which works quite well actually. So you boil the fruit up in the pan, you put it through here, strain it, leave it overnight. You'll be amazed how much extra, it seems to have stopped dripping, and you go to bed and come back, and you've actually got a lot more the next day because it just keeps on dripping very slowly overnight. And then you've got a sort of, what looks like a really cloudy, gooey stuff here in the bowl that you've put it into. But if you measure then about a pint of liquid to, again, I'm going back to imperial measures I'm afraid, a pint of liquid to about a pound of sugar, and then boil that up just like you would jam to the same, boil it up to the 222 Fahrenheit or 105.5 Celsius, and then put it in jars. You will find, with a bit of luck, you get something like that, which is an apple jelly I made earlier this year. As you can see, fairly clear jelly that I made from it. So jellies are pretty straightforward, really. Just an extra messy process, and you've got to get rid of the pulp, and you don't get nearly as much jam, of course, jelly, as you would jam, because you've thrown away all the pips and seeds and all the rest of it. But if you are using apples and things in your jelly, like the apple jelly I did that from, you don't need to, you only need to cut any bruised bit. I use windfall apples, where I just cut the bruised bits off, put it all in, didn't bother peel and didn't bother core them, anything like that. I took the stalks out actually, because they sometimes have a bit of a bitter taste. But otherwise it just all goes in, because it's all going to be served anyway, it doesn't really matter. It makes a very different product. I made blackberry and apple jam earlier in the year, quite a bit of it, and then Jen said, oh, I must prefer blackberry jelly, so then I had to go out in the pouring rain and pick some more blackberries and make some blackberry jelly. I think that's the in Toto's form. And it's quite different, the jelly, in terms of taste and obviously the texture and all the rest of it. Personally, I prefer the seeds and pips and stuff like that, but there we go, each to his own, as it were.
Yeah, can I just show them the quince next? That nice colour. And that's rowan and apple, but we're not sure about the taste.
It's a bit bitter, to be honest. I'm not sure. It looks lovely, but I'm not sure about the taste of it, to be honest.
I'm not so happy.
If you want to make the Rolls Royce of jellies, then if you can get hold of some medlars, they make the very, very best jelly ever. You'll taste. But I've got a medlar tree in the garden. It's got one medlar on this year. I had a friend who used to have one, which he used to give me a buck. If you can get hold of them, and they're not a very commonly grown thing, they were very widely grown in Tudor times, and they were very unusual, so they look like a very big rose hip, which you have to let go what appears to be rotten before you can do anything with it. But it makes a magnificent jelly. It really is the very best. The quince is good as well. Medlar has the edge, I think. for me. But then, again, it's what you can get hold of. If you're doing your own fruit, you do what you've got, don't you? You use what you've got, and that's part of the fun. Or you can go and forage what you can. This year's been a great year for foraging blackberries, for instance, elderberries. So we've done things like that. I think Helen told me to speak for 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm really all right. So if anybody feels that they want to go, I'll just say a little bit about chutneys. But if anybody wants to go, please do.
So very quickly,
Yeah.
with orange marmalade, do you have a secret for shredding it very quickly and efficiently?
Oh no, I'm afraid not. I have a very laborious method. I just sit down with the radio on. What I always do, the way I do it though, I cut the orange in half. I remount the goo in essentially a muslin. It's actually a rather decrepit-looking muslin bag I use. Actually, put the mixture in, and then I cut the thing into. I cut it in half. So I cut it again in half and pull out the put it in, and then I just sit there doing that, and hoping I'm not going to cut my finger, which I always do. Usually once a year. Once a year, I do catch my finger.
That's a lovely flavour in the marmalade.
Yeah, the finger, yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. So I don't think there is any magic way to do it. The only way I've seen that is quicker, which I don't like at all, my mother used to do it, is to mince up the peel. I don't like that, it's not the same.
When it's chunky.
Yeah, I like the strips of peel. I don't think there is a quick way to do it. But what I would say, if you are doing that, make sure you cut it what seems to be really fine, because it sort of seems quite thick when you get it out of the jar afterwards, even if you cut it pretty fine. So if you cut it chunky, it'll be huge lumps when you come to eat it for breakfast. If you find a way, I'd like to know if there's a quick way. There probably is a whizzy machine, I imagine. You can spend hundreds of pounds on which you just go and it comes out. But I've not found that. I haven't done that, I must say.
Something at Lakeland, I've seen that it's like the apple one.
I've got the apple one.
Yeah, but it doesn't cut into strips, though, does it?
Does something.
Takes the peel outside, does it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I saw that the other day.
Maybe just peels it.
Yeah, those apple peelers, we had an ancient one when I worked at a place in Cambridge that we had one of them. We used to bring that for visitors, and they reinvented it. It's a Victorian thing to peel it. What an amazing thing.
It was quite good to get my son to eat apples.
Oh, right,
because he could do it, and then you'd get this ring going up. So
it's just quite an amazing bit of machinery, and it's comes from mid-Victorian times actually. That piece of machinery. So just moving on to pickles and chutneys, and what we're doing is something completely different here. We're not using sugar, we're not using the water content of the thing really, we're using the vinegar, the acid from the vinegar to do the plate, and I always use pickling vinegar. Pickling vinegar is a higher concentration of acid than the stuff you sprinkle on your chips and whatever. It's significantly more acidic, and that gives you a more preservative effect. The problem with making most pickles is there's too much water in the things that you're pickling, and it dilutes the acid. So if you're making things like pickled onions and whatever, then if you're doing something you're not going to cook, like pickled onions or cabbage or something like that, then you need to get rid of some of the water from them by soaking them for a day or two. I usually do it for 2 or 3 days actually, in either sprinkled with salt or in a strong brine. And that draws the water. Again, it's the osmosis thing. And it takes the water out. And you'll find if you do that, your pickled onions will keep for a long, long time. I think Jen might be opening those in a second. You'll see that they were done this time last year, and they're still hard and crunchy. And if you don't do that, they won't keep that long because there's too much water in them to do that. So I use, as I say, use a big draw the water out. Now for the same reason, if you're making chutneys, you're better to use as a base for the chutney to give you the bulk something which hasn't got too much water in. So I never make marrow chutney, for instance. I think it's nearly all water, and you just spend ages boiling it up at the end to get it thick enough to do it. And so you don't really taste that anyway. So I personally tend to use green tomatoes, apples, rhubarb, that sort of stuff which is not just water, and which has a bit of flavour of its own as well. But using the high strength vinegar, pickling vinegar is usually spiced, but I always put a bit of extra chilli, a bit of extra peppercorn, a bit of extra bay leaf, a bit of extra chopped garlic, things like that. But that's to your taste. One of the treats about able to do your own chutneys and pickles is you can make them like you want them. You don't have to, you know, it's not how Waitrose or whatever decide they're going to make them, it's how you want them. So if you like them a bit more, with a bit more chilli or whatever, put a bit more chilli in. If you don't like the chilli, leave it out, sort of, you know, this sort of thing. So you can sort of tailor it. And there's endless recipes. Everybody's granny has their chutney recipe, and it really doesn't matter much. What you need some sort of, something to make the bulk. You need some sugar, you need some vinegar, you need some salt, you need some spices, and pretty much what you do with it doesn't matter much apart from that. You boil it up. Again, it's good to have a thick pan. Now, one thing you do have to be really careful, and it goes back to something I said about jam. You do have to stir chutney, because as it gets towards, it needs to be quite thick. Otherwise, it's going to pour all over the plate when you get it in the thing. So you need to cook it down. There's no magic temperature. It depends what you've got in there. And you can see when you draw a spoon through it, it leaves a line which persists for a few seconds if it's the right consistency. But you'll find as it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, it's got an irritating tendency to catch on the bottom. And you have to keep moving it around. You have to make sure you're moving it around, scraping all the bottom of the pan. Otherwise you will find it'll burn. And once it's burnt, there's very little you can do to rectify it. Because the burnt flavour just goes all through the thing. You can't do much about that. So you do have to keep that moving. There's no fixed point you can say that's done. You just have to make, oh well, that looks fairly effective, that'll do. And if it's a bit runny, next time do it a bit more, sort of thing, or if it's a bit. But as long as you can draw a spoon through and you can see by the time you get to the other side of the pan, you can still see where you started, then it's probably you're going to be all right. And that's sort of what I do. And I say, these days anyway, recipes are dead easy to get hold of. You just look on the net, don't you? You'll get endless recipes. Don't get too paranoid about it. You don't need to weigh things to the nearest gram. Just bung it in, it'll be fine. Because you're relying really on the vinegar and to some extent the sugar and spices to keep the thing preserved. When you put the stuff in jars, with pickles, you do have to be careful that the jar you used, the lid that was originally on that jar needs to be one that was originally on pickles. Don't use any other one that's been on something else, because it won't stand the acid and it will rusty. So you either use an old pickle jar. At the moment I've got 2 large jars of pickling vinegar jars full of chutney, because that's what I am. We're running out of jars, and that's what I did for now. I'll put them into smaller jars later on probably. And or use plastic lids, like old coffee jars, and these are quite good for chutney because they've got a plastic lid. But what you do need though is a reasonable seal. So what I usually do is once I put it in the jar, I cover it with cling film, a couple of layers of cling film, so that you get an extra sort of seal which takes up the and stops the moisture evaporating, because moisture will evaporate from it either. One thing I should have said as well: don't use a pickle jar for jam, because the seal hangs on to the flavour and you'll make the jam taste. So use pickle jars for pickle and other jars for jam. But coffee jars make quite good things for pickles actually, because they don't have this. Fine, you put a layer of cling film because they don't seal very well, but the cling film will do that. But they don't go rusty, and that's the thing you're after really. Yeah, the real macho pickle onions.
Very nice.
They were done this time last year. I've got a pile of, I've harvested the onions, they're sitting in the greenhouse waiting to be pickled this year at the moment.
It's got chili. It's got chili in it, Toby.
It does. Yeah, it's got, they were done with pickling vinegar with added chilli and pepper and bay and
We've got beetroot as well.
allspice. You can't draw the water out, so they aren't going to keep as well. And once they're opened, they are going to go mouldy. You do need to, if you're doing something like beetroot where you can't reduce the water content, then you need to eat them up more quickly. The onions will keep pretty much forever, a very long time. The beetroot will keep a few weeks, months, maybe, unless you put it in the fridge, of course, which is a real hassle, because it takes too much room in the fridge, doesn't it? Because it's all to do with the water content and the fact you have to cook the beetroot. You can't cut beetroot up and get the water, it just loses all its colours. So it's telling a lot to me. But obviously, I was a university teacher, so I can just talk endlessly about anything. So, but if anybody wants, you want to ask all that, just ask away.
Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you.
No problem.
You're welcome.
The only